Alright guys, so today we're going to go over the lead up to the Civil War. Now, those two videos that you saw should have gone over westward expansion, Native American issues, the War of 1847, the acquirement of most of the Southwest and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, some of the history of Texas and how it came to be part of the Union, its struggle for independence, so on and so forth. Okay, so this week we're going to talk about slavery, and next week we're going to talk about the Civil War and the aftermath. We might got to get into some of the Civil War today. I'm hoping to, just so we can get through it, so we can get through at least the 19th century and American history this year. And then next week we'll do our last video, which should be that period from maybe the last part of the Civil War, or the Civil War all the way up to 1900. It'll be real broad. Okay. First thing we want to talk about is the Missouri Compromise. The Mason-Dixon line had been established as a way of, it was the borders between Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. It was surveyed in like 1767. However, it would become kind of the demarcation line between pro-slavery South and anti-slavery North. As you can see here, if you extended the line here, it goes through half of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, but really what would happen is the line would go something like this. Okay? It would go downward. But anyway, point is, Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio all were anti-slavery. But all of this, which was part of the first 13 original colonies, was anti-slavery, other than Delaware, which was not. But Delaware very quickly got rid of slavery after 1787. So this Mason-Dixon line was kind of the unofficial line between pro-slavery South and anti-slavery North. Now, it's kind of a not real great line because Virginia and Missouri are both, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, half of them are in that, right? But Maryland, which is actually anti-slavery, is south of it as well. So it's not a great line, but it kind of gives you an idea of the line in between, I guess, the two opposing north and south factions. Okay, so everything south, other than Maryland, was for slavery. Everything north was against slavery. Now, the Missouri Compromise of 1820 did two things. First of all, actually did a number of things. It brought Maine into the Union as a free state. It brought Missouri into the Union as a slave state. It also established the 3630 parallel, which is this line you see right here. Okay? It established that as the line where slavery was prohibited north of it. It was not prohibited south of it. So in Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, so on and so forth, slavery was unprohibited. Now that's a massive zone of territory. Now, but at the same time, north of that, slavery was prohibited, which is a much greater magnitude of territory. But the South was kind of desperate to get Missouri in as a slave state because it wanted to maintain the balance. So one of the things, there's two things that you guys can talk about this week. I'm only going to give you two. There's the significance of the Dred Scott case, and we'll talk about Dred Scott in a minute. And there's the significance of maintaining a balance between the Senate, the states in the Senate. So what that means is every single state gets 2 senators, no matter what, no matter their population, no matter their size. That's not the same for the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives gets representation or representatives based on population. So in the Senate, if I have 12 states, I have 24 senators. If at the same time, those exact same 12 states, I could have 54 representatives. And one state could have 3 representatives in the House of Representatives, and another state could have 15 or 20 or whatever. Okay? Because it's based on population. So states with large populations have a large amount of representatives. States with small populations have a small amount of representatives. However, the Senate is always 2. And every bill starts in the House of Representatives. A bill is a potential legislation, so a potential law. Okay? So a bill gets started in the House of Representatives, but it must go through the Senate in order for it to be signed into law by the president. And he can even veto it as well. But the point is, it has to go through the Senate. So if anti-slavery North, which has a much larger population, wants to get anti-slavery legislation passed, they have to have more senators than the South does. So the South is desperate to make sure that the balance in the Senate remains the same. Okay, so you're going to talk. That's one way that that's one of the things you can talk about in your independent research is the significance of maintaining a balance between free and slave states. So the South is desperate to get Missouri in, which it was voting to become part of the Union at this point in time. It was a territory. They were desperate to get it in as a slave state because they had to maintain this balance because Maine was coming in as a free state. Okay? Now the Union, in order to get Maine in as a free state, and Maine, in order to make sure that it can become a state, has to compromise with the South as well. So there's a compromise. Both of them want something. All right? So Maine has to say, okay, and the North has to say, okay, we'll let Missouri come in as a slave state, but you have to acknowledge the 36th 30th parallel as the end line between prohibiting slavery in the territories and allowing slavery in the territories. Okay? Now what's interesting about this is that it's going to come back to nobody really looks at this. Like, this is kind of just something on paper because later events show that nobody pays attention to this 36th 30th parallel when it comes to allowing states in the Union. But we'll talk about that a little bit more. So this parallel, the 36th 30th parallel, prohibited north of it, allowed south of it. Missouri comes in as a free state. And as you'll notice, Missouri is all above this 36th 30th parallel. However, so is Virginia and Maryland, which was. Now, the other thing that this did, was it in 1850? Was that the compromise? Oh, never mind. Compromise of 1850 did what I'm talking about. Okay. All right. So, this kind of settles the question of slavery, puts it on the back burner. People aren't real, adamant about looking at it for the next little while. However, when Texas joins the Union, now we've got an issue. Because Texas comes in as a free state. It's 1851 that Texas comes in. Texas comes in as a free state. Now, the Great Compromise, Compromise of 1850, what this does is it says that if a free state comes in, a slave state also comes in. Okay, so it establishes that balance, is what the Compromise does. It also says, but it prohibits slavery to some degree in the territories. One second, let me double check on that. All right, so yeah. So territories, not states. Territories would be allowed to decide whether they would be free territories or slave territories by popular sovereignty. That means that everybody votes. Well, all white males vote anyway. Okay? And so they could determine that. The other point was Texas was going to give up some land in order for in return for money from the federal government. But the biggest thing that the compromise, the two biggest points, well, actually, it also outlawed or got rid of, I don't know if it outlawed. Yeah, it outlawed. It outlawed slavery in the District of Columbia, which is right up here, which is Washington, D.C. Okay? It outlawed the slave trade, not slavery. It outlawed the slave trade in the District of Columbia, which was in Maryland, which at the time allowed for the slave trade. All right, so Territories would decide whether they would be free or slave. Texas would give up land in return for money. The slave trade was outlawed in the District of Columbia, and it also established the Fugitive Slave Act. Now, what the Fugitive Slave Act did, which was actually passed in 1851, but the compromise was that it would be passed in 1851 if they would compromise in 1850. What it said was slaves, no matter where they were in the Union, no matter whether they had fled, whether they had managed to escape to the north, to the territories, to the west, doesn't matter, could be returned to their owner. So if it was found out that they were a slave, a fugitive slave, they'd run away. A slave could be in Oregon Territory. If it was found out that he was a slave to somebody who owned him in Georgia, that slave could be legally apprehended and brought back to his master in Georgia. Now, this angered a lot of people. It kind of angered everybody. The South didn't get what they wanted, which was an opening of the territories completely to the slave to pro-slave expansion. So it did not open up the territories to pro-slave expansion, which is what the South wanted. And the Fugitive Slave Act really irritated the abolitionist North, because if you escaped prior to this to these other territories, then a lot of people could just say, well, we're not going to help. But it actually made it a crime to help a fugitive slave, a slave that you knew was a fugitive. And not only that, but if you knew they were a fugitive and you didn't report them, it was a crime. Or you couldn't stop them from being taken back to their master. It actually really diminished the North's ability to help slaves escape slavery. Abolitionists are people who want to abolish slavery. Abolitionists, they want to abolish slavery. Okay, so abolitionists were not happy. The pro-slavery South wasn't happy. Nobody was really happy with this decision. But it allowed us to have another decade before open war broke out. Because open war wasn't likely to break out in 1850, but it was possible that it would have broken out 1850, 1851, had this compromise not happened. The South was extremely irritated about what was happening. Oh, that was the other point. Sorry, I forgot. That was why the South was really unhappy about this, is because California was entered into the Union as a free state. Now, Texas was entered into the Union as a slave state, so the balance was still maintained, but they weren't happy that California, which was actually booming at this time, would have opened up a lot of possibilities for slave owners, was entered in as a free state. Okay? So, Compromise of 1850 does this. Now, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, Stephen A. Douglas is at this again. He goes in and says, okay, we're going to allow these two states, Kansas and Nebraska, to decide by popular sovereignty whether they'll be free state or slave state. That means that everybody in those states, all white males again, will vote to decide how they will be admitted. So Kansas votes 51% pro-slavery, they come in as a slave state. They vote 51% anti-slavery, they come in as a free state. Now on the surface this looks really great. Okay, let them decide, sure. The only problem is everybody rushes to Kansas. Nebraska is pretty much everybody knows that's going to be a free state. Nobody really thinks that it's north. It's mainly populated by Germans or German immigrants and immigrants from Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, the north, right, that area. Another major immigration group there is the Irish. Slavery's pretty much not going to happen in Nebraska, and everybody knows it. But Missouri, which is a slave state, is right by Kansas. Kansas has a lot of interaction with Texas. By the way, Oklahoma is that territory, part of that territory that the federal government buys from Texas. But anyway, so it's right by all of this pro-slavery area, okay? and therefore it's got a really good chance of going slave. Nebraska doesn't. Kansas does. So everybody rushes to Kansas. The pro-slavery people rush to Kansas. The anti-slavery people rush to Kansas. A lot of people are rushing to Kansas to get the population there to make the vote go in their favor. Just the word escaped me on what I was looking for. Okay? So what that means is that if I get, let's say that Kansas has a population of 250,000. If I get 127,000 pro-slave people there, it's going to be a slave state, meaning white males, people who can vote there. Okay? So if I have a population of 250,000, voting population of 250,000, I get 127,000 of those people to vote pro-slave, it's going to be a slave state. So I got to get people there, right? If I'm somebody in these other southern states, because I want to maintain this balance, I want to get a bunch of pro-slavery people in Kansas just to be there sometimes. They don't even have to settle. Let's just get them there. And then the anti-slavery people are looking at it the exact same way. We got to get people into Kansas to get this. So on the surface of this, it looked like it would be great. Okay, just let them decide that. But the truth of the matter is, this issue was so national, this issue was such a big deal on a national scale that it wasn't just Kansas and Nebraska deciding, it was the nation deciding. And that means a bunch of the Northerners were running to Kansas to try to get in on that vote, and a bunch of the Southerners were trying to get on the vote as well. Only problem is, for the South, Kansas votes anti-slavery. So Nebraska and Kansas are entered into the Union as free states. Now the balance is tipped. Okay, 2 free states, more. So if we were looking at it in today's terms, well, 4 senators, 4 votes for the free states versus. So let's see here. I don't know exactly the number of states at the time. 13. There were about 26 states at the time, which means that there were 26 times 2 is 52. So that means that it was 52 divided by 2 is 26. So 26 for the South. So basically what that would mean is that the North basically had 30 votes. No, the North had 28 votes. The North had 28 votes and the South had 24. Okay? That's what that means. So the North had 28. Basically. So the North had basically the anti-slavery side had 4 more votes. The balance was 10. And the South was not happy about this. Okay? And this was really, maybe I would say, the death knell of slavery in the United States. And this is one of the reasons why the North pushed their anti-slavery position, and I'm not saying that they were wrong to do this. I'm simply saying that by pushing it as aggressively as they did, they pushed the nation toward a war rather than allowing slavery to die the natural death that it was going to die. Now, I'm not saying it was right or wrong of them to do this. All I'm saying is slavery was dying. In a capitalist sense, slavery was dying. It looked really strong on the surface, but it wasn't. So much of the production was being done by slaves in the South that white Southerners, any other kind of Southerner, quite honestly, any other kind of Southerner was being left out in the cold. Now, they were using the slaves. I mean, the slaves were such a major part of the industry that everybody kind of used them. But the only people who actually owned them was less than less than 10% of the population of the South actually owned a slave. But most of that other 90% used the slaves. However, in a capitalist sense, slavery was dying because so much money was being tied up in that upper 10% that the other 90% simply could not keep up. And if they can't keep up to buy the product that the slaves are producing, because it wasn't just cotton, that was the money product they were producing, but they were producing a lot more than just cotton. If the white Southerners, if your population cannot afford to buy your goods that you are making, capitalism dies. Because the whole idea of capitalism is that you produce, you pay your workers to produce, those workers then become your consumers. Okay? So slavery was dying. It looked really good on the surface because it was making so much money for these people, and it was being used widespread throughout the South as far as the slave being used, not owned, but being used by most of the Southern population, or a large portion of the Southern population. But on the underneath of that, slavery, everybody was looking at it being, or not everybody, economists were looking at it saying, yeah, that's not sustainable. And it wasn't. So slavery was dying a natural death. But because the North pushed so hard to get rid of it and abolish it when they did, and to abolish it so soon, yeah, it might have been until 1870, 1880, 1890 even, before it actually died, but it was dying. But they pushed really hard. They saw this opening, the light at the end of the tunnel where they could get their anti-slavery legislation passed, and they went for it with the Kansas and Nebraska. Once they got Kansas and Nebraska in there with those 4 votes, they started pushing anti-slavery legislation through. And the South knew it. So the South's looking at it saying, look, right now it is our major source of income. It's our major source of economics. Now, here's the other part that people don't really talk about a whole lot. The South was getting the short end of the stick economically from the get-go. Because bills start in the House of Representatives, so much power was held by the North because they had a larger population. So money for roads, remember we talked about national republicanism, right? This idea of the United States government funding public projects that are privately owned. Well, legislation is how they do that. So the North is getting legislation pushed through for things like the Erie Canal, right? Which benefits Pennsylvania and New York, right? And Indiana and Ohio. And what would become Michigan and Wisconsin, right? All of those. The Erie Canal benefits them. It allows them to get their goods from this whole area into this whole area relatively cheaply. The money for that came from the federal government. Well, the South doesn't have the population to push those bills through in the House of Representatives. So they are getting shafted economically pretty much across the board. As far as national Republican projects go, projects of national importance, or national or public works is what they're called. Okay, they weren't getting the money, so roads in the South were terrible, not maintained, basically just mud pits when it rained. No way of really no central planning to them. Cities in the South and towns in the South, townships in the South had less access to money. Now, part of that worked to their benefit because they were self-sufficient. The government in South Carolina, for instance, balanced the budget every year. In fact, I think they had a surplus for like 2 decades, meaning that the money they were bringing in from taxes was more than they were paying out. So they were balancing the economy, or they were balancing it, and they had less bureaucracy to manage all that money. So they actually needed less money to operate than they would later on, or than because of the bureaucracy of handling all those public funds in the North. Many of the northern cities and states did not balance their budgets and had kind of a bloated bureaucracy. A bureaucracy is basically just a bunch of organizations to maintain or to make something happen. For instance, the IRS is part of a bureaucracy. Right? Why? Because there's thousands of employees that are employed by the IRS to make sure that you pay your taxes. But then if somebody finds some loophole to paying their taxes, now we create another organization or another sub-organization of the IRS to go look at that specific loophole. So it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Okay, that's a bureaucracy. The bureaucracies in the North were much larger because they had to use public funds and maintain those public funds and to maintain oversight of those public funds. So you had a lot of people doing that. Whereas the bureaucracy in the South, not so much. So there were advantages to this, but the South wasn't getting money. And when Nebraska and Kansas came in, now they were not only not getting money and not getting support and not getting some of the legislation passed in the House of Representatives that they needed there, they also had lost a balance in the Senate, so now they were just going to get shafted more. So it wasn't just the question of slavery at play here. And a lot of people want to say that yes, it was, or it was the prime motivator. I don't know about that. I don't know if it was the prime motivator or not. I'm not going to speak on that. However, what you will have people say on the opposite side of this is that the Civil War was a question of state rights versus federal oversight. That's more of what the case was, guys. Slavery was the vehicle by which, we bulldozed into the Civil War. But the gas for that vehicle was not slavery. The gas was slave rights, or state rights, excuse me. The gas was the difference between the North and the South in a political sense, not in an economic sense. Okay? Not in the sense, or even a social sense. The South didn't have the political capability of getting what it wanted at this point in time. Now, they shot themselves in the foot by being pro-slavery. I'm not saying the South gets a pass. Slavery absolutely it is the mode by which all of this starts to run. But the gas for it, the momentum for it, the reason for it, the thing that pushed it forward was this difference politically between the North and the South, and the South simply not having the ability to get what they wanted from the North. And they, like I said, they kept shooting themselves in the foot by being on the wrong side of history. But when they broke away and created the Confederacy, they were breaking away and creating when they broke away and created the Confederacy, what they said was, we're not getting out of this system what we want. This system is not working for us. So right there, they're talking Thomas Jefferson. Whenever a government becomes tyrannical, it is not only the right of the people, but the duty of the people to overthrow it and to establish a new one. That's what he said, paraphrasing, but that's what he said. So the South's sitting here, we're not getting what we want. They're becoming tyrannical. Right now we're being politically dominated by a powerful North, by an economically, politically, and socially powerful North. Because socially they were on the right side of history, right? They're going along with everybody else. France, England, Germany, Europe, the Western world. Slavery is dying. It's interesting to me that the United States, which is the bastion of republicanism, right? It's the new experiment of freedom and republicanism and the rights of man, is the last of the Western nations to get rid of slavery. Serfdom was abolished finally in Russia in 1880. But as far as slavery, the institution of slavery in a Western country, the United States was the last one to abolish it. The last major one. Okay? But they weren't getting what they wanted. North had all the advantages. So the South, when they finally declared independence from, secession from the United States, there's reasons for it other than slavery. Most people in the South could care less about slavery. I'm pretty sure I could say that. Based on all the evidence I've seen, the majority of people in the South could care less about slavery. Now, obviously, they didn't look at them like they were, most people in the South didn't look at blacks like they were equals. Right? But that was a social construction. That wasn't that they were terrible, awful people. Now, I'm not apologizing for the South here. What I'm trying to say is that there's a balancing act that we do here. And right now, what we're doing is completely shafting all of the people in the South that lived in the South, that operated in the South, that worked in the South, that grew up in the South and operated by those same social constructions. We're judging them with the hindsight of 150 years at this point. Okay? That's how we're judging these people, and that's just not appropriate. They had reasons for why they were doing it. And right now, rather than people are saying, well, you want to diminish the role that slavery had in this. You want to apologize for the South. No, I don't want to apologize for the South. I want to look at both sides. The South had reasons for what they did. The North had reasons for what they did. But going back to what started this whole thing, as far as this part of the lecture, slavery was dying, but the North pushed it too fast. Now, they were doing what they thought was appropriate. They were doing what they thought were. I'm not judging them on this. But had they waited, had they eased into this, had they started giving the South better options, quite honestly, had they been willing to give up some of the political dominance over the finances of the United States government and started giving the South ways out with government backing, which was theirs by just as much right as anybody else's, we probably would have avoided the Civil War. Probably. I don't know. I'm just saying it's an option. But the South, slavery was dead within 40 years. Absolutely. Slavery was dead within 40 years without the emotional scarring, social scarring that happened from the Civil War. That's extended all the way to this point in time. Okay? So the Kansas-Nebraska Act gave the North this option, and they started pushing. However, the last bastion, the last defense, if you will, of slavery, quote unquote, was the Supreme Court. Now, the Supreme Court had been, I won't say packed, because it wasn't necessarily packed, but several of the Supreme Court appointees at this point in time had been appointed during the Jacksonian era, which means that they were pro-slavery, most of them. Most of them were white Southerners. Well, not most of them. A significant portion of them were white Southerners. Because that's what Jackson was, and that's who he trusted. That's who he liked, right? So he nominated people that he thought would help him. In fact, the Supreme Court justice, or the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at the time was Robert B. Towney. Okay? Robert B. Towney. Remember that name. He also was instrumental in destroying the National Bank. He's the one that gave the court ruling that allowed Jackson to go in and start the mechanisms for destroying the National Bank. So he was an ally of Jackson, and he remained an ally of the South. Now, what happened is a slave by the name of Dred Scott was with his owner when his owner went into, I think it was Pennsylvania. It might have been New York. Anyway, they went into a free state. And Dred Scott's like, and people, abolitionists, he's free. There is no slavery in a free state. Therefore, if a slave comes into a free state, he is automatically free. Now, this is obviously incorrect, right? Because Compromise of 1850 established the Fugitive Slave Act. And the Fugitive Slave Act, federal act, made it so that no matter where a slave was, if they were a slave and had not been freed by their owner, they could be returned to their owner. In fact, they should be returned to their owner by law. So it's not a great legal argument, but the abolitionists are pushing, and they think they've got a shot. Remember, they've got the vote now. They've got the light at the end of the tunnel, so they start pushing some of these things. So you're free. Robert B. Towney, this case goes to the Supreme Court. Robert B. Towney rules that no, he's not. That makes no sense that you can have your property in one state, but the minute you go to another state, it's all of a sudden not your property. That's not how this isn't to me a slavery argument so much as a central government argument, a federal government argument. I don't know that Robert B. Towney was really arguing for slavery in this case. He gets a really bad rep for doing so because he doesn't side with the slave. But in actuality, what he's saying, just on the legal basis, if I own a car in Arizona and cars have some weird thing in Utah, okay, I can't go to Utah and lose my car. It's still my car, even if I have it in Utah. That's a federal government thing. The United States, that's my property by the federal government, not by Arizona, by the federal government. That's who protects my right to property. Now, Arizona has its role in that, but I don't lose it. In fact, if I did lose it, then that would mean that really I'm going into a separate country. Because those same laws that protect my property don't protect me anymore in Utah. That basically sends the message that Utah is a separate country, an entity unto itself, and can operate unconditionally without anybody else's input. Okay? And that's not how it works. So to me, this is more of a central government argument than it is an argument for slavery specifically. Okay? But Dred Scott, he rules against the slaves, and he says, no, you cannot lose your property that you have in one state by going to another state. Now, the property in this case is a slave, and we're using that word, and people are probably, that would be offensive to people. I'm not trying to be, I'm just saying, at the time, that's what they were. And at the time, it was the slave owner's property, legally, his property. You cannot remove that property just by going into another state. Doesn't matter what that state's laws are. That's your property, and the federal government is the one that decides that. Now, if the federal government were to rule that slavery was illegal, okay. It's the federal government. Everything that happens legally within this nation is their purview. Now, we can not agree with it and do whatever we want about that. We can vote people in who will overturn it. We can have a popular uprising, whatever it is. All I'm saying is that is the federal government's prerogative to outlaw it or to allow it. And states within their borders can outlaw it or allow it as far as their citizens are concerned, or as far as their state is concerned. Okay? Meaning they can say no slave trade in Pennsylvania. Okay, fair enough. But if I bring my property in from another state, you cannot take it from me. That is not how a federal central government should operate. So, as far as I'm concerned, proper decision as a central government argument. Okay? As a legal argument. Obviously not a proper decision as a humanitarian argument. I mean, this is a human life we're talking about here, right? This is a human being. But this is what I'm talking about to some degree about this push that just happened too fast by the North. They saw the light at the end of the tunnel, they saw the chance, they saw the opportunity, and they just steamrolled into it rather than taking a step back and saying, look, we've got the advantage here. Take a knee, wait out the time, it'll die on its own. Okay? And we can even push it, we can even nudge it, we can even do little incremental things to push it along. But when you try to take a man's property, which he legally owns, that's obviously not going to go your way. You've got to do a lot of pieces prior to that before you can start doing that piece. Okay? So Dred Scott, 1857 rules. Now, and the abolitionists are obviously up in arms about this. Again, human life. You can't blame them. This guy, Robert B. Townie, ruled against a human being, essentially. So they're up in arms. The South is, hey, sweet. And so the South is looking at this kind of like, take that. In your face a little bit, slow the hell down. We have the advantage, at least in the Supreme Court, on these issues. Now that advantage isn't going to matter much in a little bit. All right, so the last piece that we're really going to talk about is John Brown's raid of 1858, Harper's Ferry. So John Brown was a violent abolitionist. He was actually involved in something called the Potawatomi Massacre in Missouri, on the Kansas-Missouri border, in 1854, or somewhere around there. I think it was 1854, where he killed 5 pro-slavery men. He murdered them. He was never convicted, I think he was charged. He was never convicted, but it was pretty clear that he's the one who did it. He was a violent abolitionist. He believed in using violence to free the slaves. So he had this brilliant idea to go and take the armory, the arsenal. So that's basically where a bunch of weapons are held. Okay, on a federal level, so a federal armory. So if anything happens, then the federal government or the army or even locals have access to munitions. He had this brilliant idea to go take this arsenal at Harper's Ferry and to then armed the slaves to start a slave rebellion in 1858. Well, he managed to actually take the ferry. He and his sons, and so 7 of them, managed to actually take this arsenal, but no slaves showed up. And because no slaves showed up, then the federal government soon almost immediately sent a detail to apprehend Brown and to retake the ferry. This, by the way, was actually led by Robert E. Lee, who would become one of the greatest generals in U.S. history. He led this detachment to retake Harper's Ferry. Most of the men were killed, all of them, I believe, except for John Brown, were killed, and he was later hanged. Now, this event shows that in a lot of ways we're beyond talking. This was the precipitory event to the Civil War in a lot of ways. We're done talking. The abolitionists are done talking. The South is done talking. We're going to hang Brown. We're going to convict him and kill him. Anybody who does this type of thing is dead, as far as we're concerned, for the South. He's a hero to some degree. I mean, I don't really look at him as a hero, but it's like, okay, finally somebody's taking action. We need to take action as well. So the North gets riled up. The South gets riled up. Within 2 years, we're going, about 2.5 years, we're going to have open warfare. But we already kind of do have open warfare now. In fact, it was almost open warfare from 1850 onward, because between Missouri and Kansas, Missourian border ruffians is what they were called, would come across the border into Kansas, and they would attack free soilers or free staters, which were people who were anti-slavery in Kansas. So the border ruffians would come across, and they would attack people who had moved into Kansas as free soilers in order to push the vote towards a free state. And then they would attack back, right? And so it actually was called Bleeding Kansas for a period of time there, because so much violence was happening in this border area between the two, because the Missourians were trying to force these free soilers out so that the pro-slavery supporters in Kansas would have the vote. And there was a lot of violence that was happening along this border. And then you get violence happening in the territories. You get the raid in 1858. And the continuation of the violence in Kansas and Missouri. I mean, it doesn't go away. And so you have kind of open violence happening along this border, along the Missouri Compromise border, and above it to some degree. You have a pretty contentious period of time throughout this. Okay? All right, so the things that you can talk about this week. You can talk about the significance of Dred Scott, why that was significant to the significance of the argument, number 1, and significant to both sides, number 2. Right? And that's your independent research thing that you can talk about, and the significance of the balance between the states. Okay? So those are your 2 things you can talk about this week. Significance of the balance between the states, and the significance of Dred Scott. And then obviously your summary of the argument. We didn't get into the Civil War. As usual, we don't get it through everything I want to get through, but I will do the Civil War next week. All right? Okay, guys. See you later.